Section 69 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 69. The First Girl by Louise Pond Jewell. They had been talking of the Marstons, who had just gone down with the torpedoed ship, and among the kindly and affectionate things said about them, the exceptional happiness of their married life was mentioned. Someone spoke of this as being rather surprising, as they had married so late in life. Then, naturally enough, another remarked what a different world it would be if every man had been accepted by the first girl he had proposed to. And he added that sometimes he thought that first choice was one of truer instinct, less tinctured with the world's sophistication than any later one. The bachelor contributed with a laugh that first girl had one advantage over the wife, no matter how perfect the latter, that she remained the ideal. And then, little by little, they came to the point of agreeing to tell, then and there, in the elegance and dignity of the clubroom suited to the indulgence of their late middle years, each one about that first girl and what she had meant to him. The explorer began. I met her in the Adirondacks and knew her only one summer. After that, I couldn't see her just as a friend, and she was unwilling to be anything else to me. So all my life I've associated her with the woods and lakes, with the sincerity and wholesomeness of the great outdoors. She had the freedom of Diana and her lack of self-consciousness. I never saw her except roughly clad, but she always suggested that line of Virgil. She walked the goddess. She was strong and lithe as a boy, could climb mountains, row, play golf and tennis with any of us, and what a good sport. She never fussed over getting caught in drenching rains, being bruised and torn by rocks and thorns, and once, when a small party of us lost our way and had to spend the night on a lonely mountainside within sound of wolves and catamounts, her gaiety made a lark of it. She could drive horses with a man's steady hands. She knew the birds by name and all the plants and trees that grew within miles, and she was familiar with the tracks and habits of all the small creatures of the forest. To me she was simply wonderful, and I confess, always has been. What became of her? They asked. Later, she married a man who didn't know a pine from a palm. I always wondered. The diplomat came next. That sort, he said, is a little too independent and upstanding to belong to my type of woman. The rough, tan skin, the strong, capable hands, big probably, the woolen skirt and blouse. They'll do very well in a girl chum for a summer, but when it comes to a wife, one's demands are different. The girl I wanted first, and I've never forgotten her. She was a queen. I knew during my first winter in Washington. You talk of Diana. I prefer Venus, wholly feminine, but never cloying. She was the kind that looks best in thin, clinging things. I remember yet a shimmering green and silver creation she wore at the inaugural ball. She didn't take hikes with me through patchy forests, but she'd dance all night long, and her little feet would never tire. She didn't handle guns or tillers, but you should have seen her pretty fingers deftly managing the tea things in a drawing room of a winter's afternoon, or playing soft, enchanting airs on the piano at twilight, or, for the matter of that, placing a carnation in a man's buttonhole. I can feel her doing it yet. She probably didn't know birds, but, by George, she knew men. And there wasn't one of us young fellows that winter that wouldn't gladly have had her snare him. Only, that was the one thing she didn't do. Didn't she ever do any snaring? Oh, finally, and the pity of it, a man who couldn't dance and had no use for society. Sometimes. How about you? The third member of the group was asked. An engineer of national reputation. Was there a first best girl for you too? Guilty, he replied, but my account will sound prosaic after these others. You know, my early days weren't given to expensive summer camps nor to Washington ballrooms. I made my own way through college, and vacations meant the hardest work of the year. But when I was a senior, all the drudgery was transformed. Paradise wouldn't have been in it with that little coeducational college campus and library and chapel and classrooms, for I found her. Just a classmate she was. You tell how your girls dressed. I never noticed how she dressed. It might have been in shimmering green and silver, and it might have been in linsey woolsey for all I knew. But she could think, and she could talk. We discussed everything together, from philosophy and the evolution of history to the affairs of the day. I spent every hour with her that I could, and in all sorts of places. There's a spot in the stack room of the old library that I always visit yet when I go back because of her. I've never known a woman since with such a mind, such breadth and clearness, and it showed in her face, the face of Athena, not Diana or Venus. I believe that with such a companion at my side to turn to in every perplexity, I could make my life worthwhile. But she saw it differently. Is she a feminist now? Slyly inquired the explorer. She too married after a while. A fine fellow, but anything but a student. I can't help. Mine, said the fourth, the socialist, will sound least dramatic of all, though I assure you the time was dramatic enough for me. You talk about your goddesses. My pedestal held just a sweet human girl, a nurse, serving her first year at the hospital, that time we had the smash-up in '80, and you talk of beauty and style and brain. But with me it isn't of a pretty face or graceful form, I think, when I recall that magic time, and least of all is it of any intellectual prowess. I'm not sure whether she knew the difference between physics and metaphysics, or whether she'd ever heard of a cosine, but she was endowed with the charm of charms in a woman, sympathy. She would listen by the hour while I poured out to her my young hopes and ambitions. I could tell her all the dreams a young fellow cherishes most deeply, and would die of mortification if even his best friend guessed at their existence. She always understood, and though she talked little herself, she had the effect of making me appear at my very best. I felt I could move the world if she would just stand by and watch. But in spite of her kindness and gentleness, she turned me down. Many times I've questioned. That was all right for a sick boy, commented the diplomat, but for a wife, a girl like Allison. Allison, echoed the engineer involuntarily. A nice name, anyway. That was her name. Why, the explorer mused. That's an odd coincidence. So was hers. Allison Forbes. Allison Forbes, breathed the socialist. Allison Forbes Marsden. And suddenly there was a silence, and the four friends looked strangely at one another, for they knew in that moment that there had been in those lives of theirs left far behind, not four first girls, but one, seen with different eyes. End of section 69. Section 70 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 70. A Sophistry of Art by Eugene Smith. On the station platform in Quanah one morning, I stopped waiting for the train for a moment to watch a man and woman painting on a large signboard across the way. The inevitable wiseacre in the little group of traveling men explained that they were really talented artists, a man and wife. The husband had contracted a throat infection in their studio back east, and physicians had ordered him to the open air and high, dry altitude of West Texas. So they had come and were earning expenses, making a series of paintings on signboards, advertisements of a lumber corporation throughout the Panhandle country. I walked out across the tracks near where the slightly stooped husband in overalls and his little wife, looking very attractive in her neat apron and sunbonnet, were at work. There was a pathos about the thing that went straight to my heart. The loyal little woman and the stricken husband there in the clear, crisp morning air and sunshine, earnestly striving, undismayed. Something, a common sympathy, thrilled me. And now the painting seemed artistic. The general idea was a lovely cottage home, built, of course, with Oakley's lumber, as was intimated. But the cottage was not glaringly new, rather mellowed a bit with time, it seemed, and was the more homelike for it. In the front stood a sweet little woman looking down a winding road, and in the expression on her face, painted by the real little woman, was joyous hope, almost certainty, of seeing the husband coming down the road to her and home after his day's work. The colors of sunset added to the beauty of the conception, which altogether made desirable the having such a little wife to wait for one each evening at such a little cottage home. And that was the purpose of it. When you thought of home building, you also thought of Oakley's lumber. The painters were happy in their work, happy as two birds building a nest. The wife, seated on her little stepladder with palette and brushes, was deftly pointing up the vines about the windows, as all good wives should. She hummed something of a tune, now and then looking gaily down at him, who laughed back up at her from his work on the winding road and distant trees. A courteous inquiry, and my being an Easterner, was a passport into their confidences. We only paint a little while in the cool of the morning and afternoon of each day, he was saying to my remarks on the weather. It's dangerous to lay on much paint at a time, he continued, for the sand ruins it. Oh, if it wasn't for the sandstorms, she chimed in. But we love the country, and the folks too. They seem so much a part of the outdoors, you know, though we expect, to go back home before long. She was looking fondly down at him. I had a little trouble with my throat, he explained depreciatively, but this western air has just about put me in the running again. It's wonderful. I could see that thankfulness in his eyes as he smiled up at his companion. I didn't blame him for loving life. In the smoking car of the belated train, we traveling men discussed the case of the painters. It's only his throat that bothers him a bit, I denied with some heat. Besides, he is nearly recovered and looks it. Yes, I know, that's characteristic. It's what they all say when they begin to perk up in a change of climate, persisted the pessimist in the crowd. But the average is 100 to 1 against them. I've seen too many lungers out here in this country. Damn a pessimist with his statistics, anyhow. Several months later, I made another trip through the Texas Panhandle country, and at each town, going up from Quanah toward Amarillo, I saw one of the Oakley lumber advertisements prominently displayed on large billboards. They were all the same, like the first one. That is, if your glance was but a passing one. But to me, who had grown interested in art and things artistic, there was a difference in the paintings. Yes, a difference. I wasn't so sure at first. It's just imagination, I pooh-poohed the idea. but later on. Anyhow, I soon found myself going directly from the station on each arrival to look up the Oakley billboard. It was never hard to find. Somehow I just got to wondering, worrying about the welfare of the young husband, the artist I had met. In the first few of the paintings I found portrayed all the life and glad hope and expectancy that I had seen sometime before in the one at Quanah. Then came the inevitable. Strange as it was, I knew that I had been expecting, dreading it, though rather in the gossip around the hotels than in the pictures themselves, where I really found it. That was the only surprise. I remember in Clarendon, the first town after you get up on the cap rock of the Staked Plains, there I saw, or imagined, it first. One is ever instinctively wary of eyesight in that land of mirages. And in each succeeding village and town as I traveled westward and upward, I felt it, saw it, there on the billboards, as if painted in half unconsciously by the artist. A faint trace of querulous doubt in the face of the little waiting wife, spirit of melancholia lying dull in the picture. As I was getting out of good night one afternoon, a little ahead of time, in the automobile that daily makes the round trip to Claude, we drove past the Oakley signboard. I was in a hurry to get on to Claude to see the trade before night and be ready to leave for Amarillo the next morning. But forgetting all this at the sight of the picture on the billboard, I asked the chauffeur to stop a minute before it. She was still smiling, the little wife, waiting there in front of their home for her husband's return, but the smile was hollow and lifeless. I knew, could see, she was full of uneasiness and dread, and was only smiling to keep up her courage. "That's quite a lumber advertisement there," I ventured. The chauffeur was drinking water from the canvas canteen. "Uh-huh," he gulped. "I seen 'em painting it." "A man and woman?" "Well, yes, but the woman did most of it. I saw her there every day for some time. Once in a while the man, her husband I guess, would be trying to help paint, but he was all in. You could tell it, the way he looked." I winced at his words. So here it was, confirmed. What I had been hoping was only imagination. Confound that pessimist. "They must have painted a good many of these signs. I see them everywhere," I continued in a disinterested manner. "There's another over at Claude," yawned the chauffeur. "I think I remember hauling them people over in the car." "Over to Claude?" "Yes, I forget. I never pay much attention to the folks I haul," he remarked casually, eyeing me in a bored way. Then we drove on. A day later I arrived in Amarillo from Claude, glad, for it was my trip's end. I started walking uptown from the station to stretch my legs. Besides, well, there across the street, on a vacant lot, was the Oakley billboard and the picture. The late afternoon sunlight fell full across it. I looked at the woman in the picture, whom I had come to know for the real little wife, the artist, painting from her heart. She stood smiling, but behind the smile I read doubt and dread realized, and hope, almost dying hard. For the smile was but a poor attempt, and the joyous expectancy I saw shining in her eyes months before at Quanah was not there now. There was a subtle air of unmistakable despair about her. Her very frailty and dependency and loyal effort to keep her smile wrung from me a quick sympathy. I turned back to the drab routine of life sadly, and picking up my grips, saw the pessimist standing on the sidewalk with his detestable knowing look. There behind him came the wiseacre. It was one of those little coincidences of a drummer's life which so often find the same parties together again. "I was just looking at another one of the pictures, the last one, I guess," I said suddenly, feeling unashamed of my concern and sadness. "Last one?" exclaimed the wiseacre, full of ready information. "Why, man, that's their first one.
Here's where they began last year. I saw them in St. Paul 3 weeks ago. Happy as wrens. End of section 70.
Section 71 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 71, The Message in the Air, by B.R. Steffens. The typewriters were clicking busily in the place. Everyone seemed honestly, industriously at work. Looking out of the aperture prepared for the purpose, Lance Allison saw nothing suspicious. Yet Monsieur the General had been so sure that information was leaking in some mysterious way from this very room. Lance had been surprised that the fame of an American detective should have made any impression in France. More surprised when the General, on learning his identity, had personally solicited his aid. Sitting with ears as well as eyes alert, his quick brain began to dissociate the sound of the typewriters one from another. That tall girl in black, the one with the pale face, he amended in his thought, so many, alas, were in black. That girl wrote with an even monotony in consonance with her expressionless countenance. The pert little lass in blue seemed to write each word with an emphasis, for her spacing was noticeable each time. And so it went, each typist showing some marked peculiarity as his ear picked out the particular rhythm. His examination had reached the last one, and for the first time he observed its operator closely. Something familiar and different about that girl. Not her clothes, not her coiffure. Nothing he could put a finger on. Then he caught the click of her machine. Different from any of the others, it seemed to jerk out the words and syllables with amazing irregularity, dwelling on one letter, sliding another, pausing between. Here, too, was something hauntingly familiar. In the meantime, men came and went, and Lance's watchful eye followed the slightest movement made by each newcomer. At any moment, some signal might give him a clue to the disclosures which the General declared seemed to be made daily. A timid country lad entered, wiping the dew of embarrassment from his brow. After some awkward hesitation, he conferred with one of the clerks, evidently stumbling and halting in his inquiries. No word of the colloquy reached Lance's ear, but he suddenly became aware of a message in the air, clear, deliberate, reiterated. 50,000 English left Paris this morning. Destination, Arras. An hour later, the girl who somehow seemed different was confronted in the private quarters of Monsieur the General by Lance Allison, American detective. Bright-eyed and defiant, she smoldered under the guard's restraint. "You are an American." There was curt reproach in the detective's tone. "Well, what of that?" she snapped. "How came you a traitor to the Allies?" Then, as she did not answer, he bowed to Monsieur the General. "This girl gave out her information to a young clodhopper today, more than likely some other one yesterday and the day before, or to him in a different disguise. At any rate, they were men who could spell English or American," he added whimsically. "But how, Monsieur le Detective?" He approached her not, nor even looked toward her. "No," smiled Lance, but he had his ear cocked in her direction. He turned to the seething girl. "Now make a clean breast of it, miss. You are done for. What evil spirit prompted treachery in one born under the stars and stripes?" Suddenly the smoldering fire burst into the flame of speech. 'Twas Jean Armand, the low-down dog, pretended to love me, kissed me, took my hard-earned money for his own comfort, and then, the day he went to the front, he married Elise, a stupid, wax-faced doll. Then I swore to betray France as he had betrayed me, and I have done it. But how? The General's question was addressed to the detective. By the clicks of her typewriter, monsieur. She practiced a peculiar jerky touch so that it would become unnoted. Then when a spy came in, was the hand on the heated brow the signal, I wonder? She talked to him by the dots and dashes of the Morse code with as much clearness as if the words were breathed into his ear. Yes, and it took an American to find me out. She glowed with strange exultation. These conceited Frenchies were all at sea, and Jean, the husband of the fat Elise, fell yesterday under a charge from troops I sent to his regiment. So, I don't care what you do to me now. My work is done. End of section 71.
Section 72 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Short Stories from Life by Various. In a Garden by Catherine Runscomb. Dick Halcombe stood waiting on the shady station platform. A little groom appeared suddenly and breathlessly. "Sorry to be late, sir," he gasped. "Mrs. Page and Miss Laura have gone to Mrs. Wingert's garden party and left word for you to join them." "Damn," muttered Halcombe. He had had a hard day in the city and felt quite unequal to dragging himself about, wilted and irritated, any longer. Really, he considered settling back into the motor. He was getting pretty fed up with this insatiable lust of Laura's. He wondered whether when they were married and she was away from her mother, he would be able to instill in her a more normal enjoyment of her pleasures. He thought vaguely of not going after all, of awaiting them at the house. But a vision rose before him of Laura all evening wrapped in her delicate fury of aloofness, something too inhumanly polite to be called sulking, but of shattering import to nerves on edge, and he decided grimly that he was too hot, too tired. In the last analysis, it was less trouble to go to the garden party. By this time, they were humming smoothly up to the Wingert's gates. The breeze had cooled the heat of his brow, but his thoughts were growing only more feverish with the passing moments. He halted the chauffeur suddenly. "Let me out here, Lane. I'll walk up to the house. I need exercise." It was pleasant to stroll along the driveway, to stretch his cramped limbs, and absorb at leisure the careful beauties of the land about him. The lonely graciousness of tall poplar trees, the low flowering crimson of rhododendrons, ministered gratefully to his troubled soul. New satisfaction filled him as he discovered no people in sight. They must be the other side of the house, on the terraces, he thought restfully. And then, suddenly, he stopped short, staring. Just ahead, in a clearing, was an old Italian fountain, grey stone, carved and mellowed by the centuries, water splashing musically into its basin. Sitting on the edge was a tall young girl, the adolescent grace of her body showing clear and white through the classic scantness of her shell-pink draperies. Diana herself she might have been, nymph-robed and formed, her chestnut hair bound about by a silver fillet, her long white legs uncovered, dangling in the water. He felt a wild certainty that if he spoke, she would melt away into the spray of the fountain. And then she turned her head and saw him. "You are late," she said, in a very clear, low voice that merged into the splashing water. Yes, I'm late, he stammered. I wonder who you are. She stared into his eyes with the deep unconscious gravity of a child. I am Athena, she answered simply. Athena, he gasped. Good heavens, then you are a goddess or a nymph. She laughed, and her laughter sounded in his ear more like the fountain than the fountain itself. Oh no, she reassured him. We all have Greek names because they are more beautiful. We all? Good Lord, child, who are you? Why, I am Athena, one of the Morris dancers. We came to do our spring dance for the party. How absurdly simple, he thought, and yet how insufficiently it explained the wonder of her. Why are you here, alone? He went on. He could do nothing but question her. He had to get to the bottom of her, somehow. We are through dancing, and the people tired me. He sat down on the edge of the fountain, and she moved up beside him, touching him, a divine friendliness in her deep blue eyes. How did they tire you, child? He asked gently. They are all so artificial and so conscious. We are taught how terrible this consciousness of self and sex is. Helena Morris teaches us that woman is only really beautiful, really strong, when she is quite unconscious and unstudied. He eyed the grave little lecturer amusedly. Do you understand all that, Athena? He ventured. Why, yes, she said. We are all very intelligent. It's the wholesome life we lead and the perfection of our bodies. He threw back his head and laughed. I like you when you laugh, she told him suddenly. I like you to throw your head back and the kind little crinkles round your eyes. When you are not laughing, you look so tired. I am tired, he admitted. Tired and disillusioned most of the time. Perhaps it's my unwholesome life and imperfect body. He watched her, glowing with unreasoning pleasure at her laugh. Humor too, he cried. Child, you are wonderful. Tell me about yourself, everything. I must know the magic that evolved such perfection. Give me your hand, she said. There, now you can understand me better. There isn't much to tell. I am 17 and have lived with Helena since I was 8. There are 20 of us. She teaches us wonderful things, not hideous accomplishments, but real things that will help us. Greek and Latin, and the care of our bodies, and the worship of beauty. We all dance and sing and play, and we paint and write verse, and translate the classics, and read to each other. And we are very strong and hardy because of our simple lives. We can beat men at their own games, although we are so slight. We wear few clothes, nothing to restrain or disfigure us. And when we dance, we don't learn special steps. We express in ourselves whatever we are dancing, sorrow or love or spring. See, I will do you part of our spring dance. She drew her white dripping legs from the fountain and danced before him, a thing so light and delicate, so breeze-blown and whimsical, so altogether lovely that his distrust of her humanity returned to him unbearably. She stopped, a sudden flush of rose and gleam of white, and dropped by his side again. And every night, she went on, as though there had been no interruption, we say our creed. I believe in beauty, all the beauty that ever has been and ever will be in the world, and I will worship and serve it with the highest there is in me, always. He could not speak at first, then finally, unevenly, I can't presume to praise your theory of life, Athena, any more than I could your dancing. Thank you for them both. She put her hand on his knee, looking at him whitely, a little wildly. What is your name? She asked. Dick, he answered, as simply as she had told him hers. I should like to marry you, Dick. He stared at her. So you include marriage in your scheme of life? He said dully. Yes, Helena says our marriage laws are terrible. But while there is no substitute, if we love terribly, it is right to marry. I want to marry you, Dick, to be with you always, and take the tired look away from your eyes. Child, he cried, you don't know me. It doesn't matter, she told him quaintly. Love often comes this way. He took her hand against his cheek. Dear, he said, I am 35, a pretty world-stained and world-weary creature. Your radiant youth was given you for a better man than I. I love you, Dick. I have never loved before. Athena, I am going to marry someone else. She trembled against him. Someone you love? She cried. Dick, someone you love as you could love me? Is she as young and beautiful? Could she amuse you and care for you and adore you always, always as I would? Athena, he said slowly, there is no one like you in the world. I love this other girl in my own way. Not as you should be loved, but I'm not fit for such love as that. I can't marry you. Athena, dear, don't make it too hard. She sat silent. Then, Dick, would you kiss me? He took her gently in his arms. In the distance, people were moving. There was a rustle and a chatter. He let her go suddenly. Goodbye, dear, he said. Goodbye, Dick, she answered dully. Once he turned back and saw her, drooping, rose-white, against the old grey fountain. From the gay group ahead, Laura detached herself, ruffled and fluttering. You're late enough, she greeted him. Yes, he said. Then with an effort, have you seen the Morris dancers? Oh yes, we all did. I think they're rather disgusting. So few clothes, and so much throwing themselves about, don't you? You forget, he answered slowly, that I have just arrived. End of section 72.
Section 73 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tammy Leon. Short Stories from Life by Various. A Clever Catch by Lloyd F. Loux. She was a thief and he knew it. He had followed her in her travels where she posed as a saleswoman. At various times he had thought to capture her, but she evaded him. He feared he had too little evidence, and she was so wily and so clever. When he saw her sun-kissed hair and inviting lips, he felt abashed to think of associating crime with her, and so he waited for more conclusive evidence. He wished to be sure. How embarrassing it would be to accuse her and then find her innocent. And yet he knew she was dangerous. Then one day he realized something odd. He had been robbed. He, the cleverest detective on the force, had been robbed. Yes, it was hard to realize. And by the very woman he was seeking to capture. Yes, he knew she must have done it. Now he would bring her to justice. But how? He had no actual evidence more than his own conviction. Ah, yes, he would put on a bold front and bluff her. Yes, bluff her. How happy he felt. Why, after he made this capture, he would be the proudest man on the force, and he could have the satisfaction of saying he had wrung the confession from her. So he togged up and put on a bold front and a wise air and started out. But suppose she suspected his bluff? Oh, horrors! Imagine his chagrin, the wisest man on the force, and made a plaything of by a baby of a woman. But he was started, and only cowards turn back. Suffice it for us to know that he succeeded, and escorted her to the nearest magistrate's office, and she confessed. Yes, he had the satisfaction of hearing her take oath to the confession. Then the magistrate appointed him to be her keeper for life. The case was closed with the best wishes of the magistrate. End of section 73.
Section 74 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rob E. Brown. Short Stories from Life by Various. Strictly Business by Lincoln Steffens. There's an extra, a Christmas girl downstairs that I think you'll want to keep. She's a worker, but... The big store manager looked up at the tall, prim New England woman who was the head of his employment bureau, and he understood. But he's a brute. But, he insisted, her references aren't good. Not good, he said. You mean they ain't good people? Oh, she exclaimed, they're good people, they're very good people, but they prefer not to speak for or against. I see, he growled. A case for bad people. Send her up to me. And up came the case, another Puritan, slim, alive, afire. I know, she began, I know what you're going to say, every word of it. I'm fired. But first I must hear a lecture, the same old lecture, so far away, but cut it short. Won't you be seated? He said politely. Thanks, she mocked. He rose, and with a chivalrous bow begged her to please be seated. No, she declared decidedly. I'll take it standing so I can get out if I don't like... Sit down, he bellowed. She sat. He stood glaring at her. Think I'd let you stand there lecturing and judging me? He growled. And he lectured and judged her. Then he, too, sat. How do you know what I was going to say? He demanded. Because you all say the same thing, she flashed. Everywhere I work, they tell me I'm bad, so I'm discharged, but they all give me that lecture on how to be good. Out of a job. She named places she had worked, stores where the managers and the conditions were notorious. They gave it to me at Freeman's, she sneered. And, she jeered, at the one-price stores. Everywhere I get it, not only from you bosses. I see the other girls catch on to my story and with looks at me pass it on. Poor thing, they whisper. And then, of course, the poor thing is fired. She didn't look like a poor thing. She looked like a very brave thing to this manager of women, but he felt, with his man's intuition, the despair that was washing her courage away. So he was kind. How old is the child? He asked brutally. 5. Who takes care of it while you're at work? Mother. And you support all 3? Yes, and she blazed. You needn't worry about that. You fire away. I'll make out somehow. Only don't tell me that I'm bad again. I know that, too. Don't I tell it to myself every hour, every day, and if I forget it for one little hour, doesn't someone remind me? He was afraid she'd break, and he didn't want her to. Not her. Too proud, too brave. You needn't worry about me either, he said. This is a business house, strictly business. No sentiment and no scruples. We're here to make money, and we're on the lookout for women who'll work and work hard for us. We don't mind a little thing like a little child. Fact is, a little... She was lifting up from her chair. Which is it? He asked roughly. A boy or... A girl, she said, and she dropped back. The fact is, he resumed, a little girl at home makes the mother work harder in the store, and that's the report on you. They say you're a hard worker, and so I'd like to keep you on regular, for life. She lifted again. But, he said. But, she collapsed. I don't see, he said, how you can work hard, regular, if you go on telling yourself that lie every hour, every day, that you're bad. He got up huffily. How bad are you, anyway? How good you been since, during the last 5 years? As good as I was before, she blazed, springing to her feet. He calculated. "I'll bet you are. And I'll bet that's pretty good. Good enough for us. We ain't so awfully good ourselves. Quick sales, small profits, and satisfied customers. Lots of 'em. That's what we call good." She was reaching for him again, with hands, with eyes. "But," he struck, "you can't do much for us and the little girl if you're afraid every hour, every day, that you'll be found out and fired. We got to cut out fear." "You mean?" she gasped. "I mean," he thundered, "I mean that you got to cut out that every hour, every day business. See? It's rot anyhow. You're as good as anybody, and if anybody here says you ain't, you come to me and I'll tell 'em this is a women's business, run for profit, and women, including mothers, women, children, and money. You on?" She stood there staring, comprehending, and he felt that she wanted to break, but "Now, none of that," the brute commanded. "Not here. This is business, strictly business. You get back on your job, d'ye hear?" "Yes," she nodded. She heard, and she bolted for the door. But as she opened it, she turned and she broke. "God, how I will work! How I will!" End of section 74.
Section 75 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. Short Stories from Life by Various. The Advent of the Majority by Stella, Wynne, Herron. Colonel Scipio Breckenbridge stopped polishing the lighthouse lamp and stared out across Lone Palm Key to where the blazing yellow sand met the dark blue waters of the Gulf. Yes, there they were again, hobnobbing on the beach. The alien Higgins, his face a beef red from alcohol within and the tropic sun without, stretched prone, the breeze flapping his loose sailor's pants around his skinny ankles, the captain erecting a tarpaulin tent against the day of the great 4-yearly event, the presidential election. Yes, indeed, make no mistake, Lone Palm Key is a part of the United States. The speck of an island that flips up out of the Gulf like the tip end of a fish's tail is listed as the 66th precinct of Florida. For 20 years now, the colonel had religiously cast one vote for the Democratic candidate. The captain one for the Republican candidate. For 20 years, the captain and the colonel being the entire population, the 66th had split 50-50, and for 20 years both had cherished the secret hope of one day carrying it. Mr. Higgins had drifted into Lone Palm, literally, on a hatch top of the ill-fated Petrel 2 months before, and it was not long before his lamentable failing made itself manifest. Mr. Higgins was unhappy, unless drunk. When his entertainment ceased, and it looked as if, through sheer thirst, he would have to consent to be taken to Key West with the captain's next cargo of sponges, non-human, he had discovered a cast-up keg of whiskey. Such an act of Providence almost restored his waning faith in God. But alas, for an acrid week now, the sacred fount had been dry. This time he would surely be frozen out. But now, here was the captain encouragingly friendly, almost chummy, with him. The colonel strode across to the recumbent Higgins and touched him with his foot. "Higgins," he asked, "do you reckon to vote on Lone Palm this election?" "I have that intention," replied Mr. Higgins gently. "Are you Republican or Democrat?" The colonel's voice trembled in spite of himself. "I haven't decided yet," and Mr. Higgins let his gaze drift again skyward. The colonel met the captain's perfidious eyes across the prostrate form of the potential majority. In that silent glance there was a declaration of bloody war. From that moment began the golden age on Lone Palm for Mr. Higgins. With flattering frequency he drank healths to the grand old party, then to the party that gave birth to Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson, sir. But no maiden, pressed by 2 suitors, was ever more coy in avowing a choice than he. A week before election, the captain's and the colonel's liquor ran out. Mr. Higgins, to his horror, began to get sober. The day before election, the captain and his sloop disappeared. The colonel did not wait to investigate. He also hoisted sail for Key West. That night, both the captain and the colonel unloaded mysterious cargoes. At midnight, after wandering constantly between the captain's bungalow and the lighthouse, Mr. Higgins fell down in the sand, impartially between the 2 abodes. The captain and the colonel, in silence, removed the political enigma to his sailcloth tent. Mr. Higgins did not appear at the polls until early noon. It was evident that the combination of Jamaica rum and Kentucky Mountain Dew had made terrible ravages on a constitution even so immune to spirituous shocks as his. "Drink's the cause this here country's going to the dogs," he remarked, through pallid, parched lips, as he entered the booth. His ballot cast, he disappeared, still enwrapped in mystery and silence. At exactly 6 o'clock, the colonel arose. "The polls of the 66th precinct, Monroe County, state of Florida, are now closed. We will proceed to count votes. Captain Hartford?" The colonel thrust into the box a hand that shook in spite of him, and drew out a ballot. "1 Republican." The captain's heart leaped. "1 Democratic," announced the colonel tremulously. The captain waited, staring at the floor. Finally he looked up. The colonel was gazing as if hypnotized, his bulging eyes fastened on the ballot in his hand. At last the announcement came. "The Prohibition Party, 1 vote." 2 minutes later they found this pinned to Mr. Higgins' empty tent. "I don't know what I done because conscience suddenly came to feel the orful curse of drink have made free to borrow a sailboat with leave same at Key West." The colonel drew himself up in his Prince Albert. "The 66th has again split even, sir," he announced. End of section 75.
Section 76 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 76. The Night Nurse by Will S. Gidley. It was long after the midnight hour in the dimly lighted wards of the field hospital back of the English battle lines at Ypres, and pretty white-capped Nydia, the nurse best beloved by the wounded soldiers. Nydia, with the face of a Madonna and voice as soft and soothing as that of a mother crooning a lullaby to a sleeping babe, was flitting about among the cots, adjusting a bandage or pillow here, and giving a swallow of water or medicine there, and doing everything possible for the comfort of her charges. There was something of a mystery about Nydia. Nobody knew her history or antecedents. She had appeared at the hospital and proffered her services at a time when they were badly needed, and the medical staff had accepted the offer and set her at work without further questioning or investigation. From the first, Nydia was very popular with the patients to whom she ministered, far more so than she was with the grim-visaged Surgeon General in charge of the field hospital. Said he one day to his assistant, "This angel-faced nurse we've taken on lately may mean well, but I am afraid she is a bit careless. Altogether too many of her patients are dropping off, unexpectedly. I'll have to look into the matter."
which he did later on, but that, as Kipling says, is another story. Return we now to Nydia on her nightly rounds. She pauses at the cot of a stalwart young English captain who is suffering from a gunshot wound received a few days before, and bends over him with a look of anxious solicitude on her face. "How is the pain tonight, my captain?" she asks in a low, sweet voice like a caress. "Bad, bad," he replies slowly, "but I can stand it, dear, so long as I have you for a nurse. Just think, only a week since you first came to my cot side, and already I love—" "Hush, my brave captain," she breaks in on his rhapsody. "You must not think of such things when you are suffering so from your wound. It will be time enough for that tomorrow. Tonight you must sleep. I must use the needle to quiet your pain. And when I wake tomorrow, may I talk to you of love? Yes, when you wake, my captain, you may talk to me of love. When you wake. Listen, dear," she went on in a whisper so low that only he could hear. "I am going to lull you to sleep with a story of myself." She paused long enough to use the needle and then resumed whispering in his ear. "Don't interrupt or try to ask questions, my captain. There isn't time for that. In 3 minutes you will be asleep, and I must talk fast. You no doubt believe me to be either French or English. I am neither. I am from beyond the Rhine, a true daughter of the fatherland. When the war came, I had an affianced lover in the German army, a young lieutenant who had been sent to England on a secret mission. There he was arrested, tried, and executed as a spy in the Tower of London. Yes, the English shot my lover for a spy. Since that, my only thoughts have been of revenge. That is why I am here acting as nurse, and why my patients die. The English sent my lover out into the great unknown, alone. I will send 1,000 English to keep him company. Today, my captain, you said you would gladly die for me, so I am taking you at your word. I have just given you a fatal dose of the hypodermic, and when you wake, it will be in another world with my brave Wilhelm, who is named for the great warlord. When you meet him, tell him that I sent you, and give him my love. Ha ha! Do you hear, my captain? Give him my love, and tell him that each night, Providence permitting, I will send him a new messenger bearing my greetings. That is all. Goodbye, my captain. The end is near. I am going to kiss you now, so you may die happy." She bent lower over the cot of the dying officer. He had not spoken before during her self-revelation, but now his eyes, filled with horror and loathing, rolled upward to meet hers, and with a final effort he hissed forth the one word, "Fiend!" Nydia smiled, a grim, mirthless smile. "No, not fiend, my captain, only a German." End of section 76.
Section 77 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alan Lawley. Short Stories from Life by Various. Why the Trench Was Lost by Charles F. Peach. Not 2 miles away lay his home. Metre by metre, Joffre's nibbling had forced the Boches back over the death-sown fields of the Argonne. And now, as he sat in his cunningly hidden nest aloft in a tree-top, observer for the battery of 75s, his telescope, wandering from the German trenches, brought home so close that he seemed almost to be standing in his own garden. It was so close, he thought, just over there, and it was so good to be able to watch little Marie playing at the door, and to peep inside into the kitchen where Jean was working, or to follow her from room to room as her slim figure flitted past the windows. He had worried so when Papa Joffre's masterly retreat had left her there alone, but this was the 4th day now that he had kept watch over her, and soon, he said to himself with a smile, soon that little home was sure to lie back of the French lines in safety. The day was quiet. Only, intermittently, a cannon barked or a rifle spat across the wire entanglements. And all the morning he had sat watching Marie's flaxen tresses bobbing among the rose bushes, and dreaming of when the war ended. And suddenly the picture changed. Marie had dropped her dolls and is racing into the kitchen. The door slams. He almost hears the bolt shot too, he thinks, and a squad of Uhlans rides into the yard. 4 months past, he had driven that picture from his mind. It couldn't be. Oh, it couldn't be. And now in sight of home, it came in grim reality. So close, and yet as well be at the ends of the earth, with a German line between them. He steadied the telescope in time to see a German butt smash in the door, and the officer stride in. The German batteries opened with a crash. A charge was coming, but he had no eyes for the enemy. He felt, rather than saw, a grey-green wave with a crest of steel flow up from the German trenches and over the dead man's land, and instinctively he shot orders into the transmitter at his lips. 200 meters, 175 meters left, and as the little puffs of shrapnel began to blossom over the grey-green wave, his gaze swung back to the little cottage. And then he forgot the Germans, forgot his comrades in the endangered trench, forgot war, everything. For a figure, a woman's figure, struggling, fell past a window in the arms of a uniformed figure. He thought a scream came to his ears. For one insane second, he started down from his station. He must go. He was so close. She needed him. And then his eyes fell on the struggle below. He realized how far it was, how helpless he was. But there was a way, and he began to snap orders into the transmitter. 1,500 meters, 8 degrees left. A puff rose on the highway running past his home. 1,600 meters, and a shell exploded at the little stable. 1,650 meters. He shot another order over the wire, and another, and another, and then battery, fire, and with a cry fell headlong from the treetop as the little home and its tragedy vanished in a whirl of smoke and wreckage. End of section 77.
Section 78 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 78. The King of the Pledgers by H.R.R. Hertzberg. The Editor of Life, 31 West 17th Street, New York City.
I send this communication to you rather than to the editor of one of the country's daily papers, because your publication is national and even international, instead of being a more or less local one, and also because the sketch of my life it contains, true though it is, has an appearance of sufficiently fictional to fit one of your short story numbers. My special purpose in wishing to have this autobiographical sketch published is that it may warn and protect a worthy body of men, the Roman Catholic priesthood of the United States, against a class of grafters which preys upon them, and of which I was the king for nearly 10 years. But knowing mankind in general, and myself in particular, fairly well, I have no doubt there is another reason for the wish, to wit, that vanity of vanities which compels all crooks, conmen, grafters, to brag of their exploits occasionally, and which, through a perverse viewing of viciousness as prowess, causes the most of men to be prouder of their falls from grace than of the good things they have done. Up to this very day, 10 years ago, I was wealthy and happy, the wealth I had inherited and the happiness I had married. Then my happiness died with my wife, and the same evening my wealth disappeared with a dishonest manager. There was nothing left me but our little daughter, a child of 8, and some $2,000. The former I gave into the care of the Dominican sisters, at whose convent in a small eastern town my wife had been educated, and who would, I felt sure, make a true woman and lady of the girl. And the money I also turned over to the nuns for my child's keep as a boarding pupil until she was 18. So I remained alone with my responsibility, the need of providing for my daughter's later future. This purpose simply had to be achieved, and that within 10 years, because when I recovered from the sickness, partly brought about by my wife's death, the doctor, a scientist of note and a close friend, told me frankly that I was afflicted with a disease of the heart, which would not let me live no longer than a decade, and this only if I remained as exceptionally temperate as I had always been. God knows I did my best to obtain honest and fairly remunerative work, my best friend, but I failed utterly, and finally I came to think of work that was not honest. Grafting began to seem almost a duty, what with my pennilessness and my responsibility. Still, I did not know how to graft, not at all. A bit of street corner talk it was that put me wise. I heard a fellow ask another to have a drink, and I heard the other's answer. "No," said he, "no more of that for mine. I've been to Father Kelly's and took the pledge for keeps, and the good man's give me $5 to help the wife and the baby till I can get a new job." "He has taken the pledge, and the priest has given him $5, I repeated to myself, and then what poets call an inspiration came to me. There might be money in taking the pledge continually, as a business. First, I smiled at the odd, fantastically sacrilegious conceit, but I grew serious. The responsibility, yes, it should be spelled with a capital, looming large in my mind's eyes. Soon I was walking rapidly toward the nearest Catholic church and calling for the pastor, a priest whom I did not know and who did not know me. My clothes were rather shabby by this time, and I may have looked dissipated, thanks to my several months' incessant worrying. And the priest received me, and I took the pledge, before God and his mother and the whole court of heaven. And the kindly old father asked me whether I was in need, and when I stammered a yes, he gave me a bill and his blessing, and I was again on the street, a successful grafter. To appreciate the enormity of my self-contempt at that moment, you must know that I had steadily been not only what is usually meant by a gentleman, but also a sincere practical Catholic, while now I was a petty swindler and a swindler of my church. Almost did I return to the priest and tell him the truth. Responsibility appeared, however, and led me away. At a distance from the priest's house, I looked at my 30 pieces of silver, which were a $10 greenback. Then I judged that my appearance of decent poverty was an asset of sorts, that the gentleman gone wrong naturally elicited more sympathy of heart and purse than the commoner barroom loafer. Thereafter I became the king of the pledgers. Yes, there are many pledgers in the land, professional pledge takers, who are also professional drunkards, for Catholic priests are easily imposed on, since they're almost always warm-hearted men, and since their faith and their calling render charity, helpfulness, imperative, impel them to extend the benefit of the doubt to every applicant, however worthless looking, for fear of sinning against charity. Wherefore even the least plausible pledger is sure to pocket a donation each time he takes the pledge. The professional pledger must be a traveler, of course. The most of cities can be worked to a finish in a week, but there are 3 at least which have kept even the king of the pledgers, with all his sobriety and diligence, busy for 4 or 5 months. As I have said, I was exceedingly successful. 2 weeks ago, my bank account, piled up through pledging only, totaled $9,902. With 88 additional dollars, I would have enough to purchase for my daughter the annuity, sufficient to keep her comfortable all her life. That was the object of my more than 9 years' swindling. 3 times had I visited the little one since I took her to the convent. The last time she was 16, and a happy, gentle, flower-like girl, gladdeningly and saddeningly like her mother. And I wrote her and heard from her every month. Well, that day, 2 weeks ago, when I'd found myself so near my goal, I went out to work as usual. My victim was a young priest, just ordained, the son of a multi-millionaire who had given up a brilliant worldly position. I was the first person to whom he administered the pledge. He was moved to the core, and he gave me $100. My life work was done. In almost childlike glee, I ran back to my room, there to draw the check necessary for the immediate purchase of my girl's annuity, and there I found a letter from the child. She asked for my fatherly consent, that she might enter the Dominican Sisters' Order as a novice. She had a true vocation, said she, had always meant to be a nun, and now that she was 18, "It is my heart's wish, Father dear," were her words. A note from the Mother Superior confirmed her declaration. Having read, I fell back in my chair and laughed crazily at the joke that was on me. Then I thanked God for the child, and then I wrote a check for all the money I had, went to my last victim at once, told him everything, handed him my check and his $100 to spend in charity, but not by way of gifts to pledgers, and fell into unconsciousness. From that hour on, I have been dying in a hospital bed. My daughter has received my consent, and the young priest will send her her father's love and last blessing when I am dead in a day or so, and I shall die in peace. Very truly yours, the ex-king of the pledgers. End of section 78.
Section 79 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Short Stories from Life by Various. A Po-lice-man by Lincoln Steffens. "Chief," said Mickey Sweeney, police reporter, to the chief of police, "my paper wants the goods to prove whether that red-headed crook, Captain Mahoney, is a crook or an honest man." The chief was about to light a cigar. He blew out the match and turned an anxious face to Mickey. Twice the reporter had saved his official life. There was nothing he would not tell him, if he really wanted to know it. Nothing. He looked at the boy darkly. Then he looked away, off across the humming restaurant. off across the humming years, and the chief's face cleared. "Mickey," he said, "when I was young, younger than you, and a green cop, greener than you, I was posted on 6th Avenue, East Side, between 28th Street and 33, the heart of the Tenderloin, and my beat with the beat of the blood of it, and the life and the death. One night, one of my first nights, a fly cabman, one of them nighthawks that picked up drunks to take 'em home and took 'em instead to the park and robbed 'em. I wasn't on to the game then, but because of the tips they gave the police about other crooks, we let them operate. Well, this nighthawk drives up close to the curb by me and says, 'Hey, Bill,' he whispers, hoarse, 'there's murder and riot in the half-shell.' I hot-footed it to the oyster house. Empty, not a head in sight. But I listened, and underneath hell was boiling. Yells, curses, thuds, and I piped at the end of the counter, a bit back, a trapdoor with the lid off. I dropped in. I come down on them. One of my feet scraped down the face of some bloke, and he cussed. My other leg got across a feller's shoulder, and stuck so I went down on my head, and my hands touched the murdered body. They was all blood, which helped me up. That, and hearing near me a call, low and quick, a cop, and the chorus singing, 'Kill him!' So I come up standing and strike out blind with the stick, but I begin to look around, careful, to get the lay. There was one gas jet rear. By it I made out the feller that did the murder. He was being fought over. Some, the friends of the dead man, desirous to kill him. Others, his friends, to save him. I made for him. He was at the back, under the light, at the tip end of the 2 twisted strings of crazy mad fighters. I had to go along between 'em, but that wasn't so hard. In the surprise of my arrival, the clinch had broke, and that let me pass. That and my stick on their faces. So I got through, grabbed my man by the collar of all the shirts and coats he had on, and I threw him back of me onto an old poker table that stood in the corner. So far I enjoyed it, but the mob rallied. The 2 fighting sides joined, and all together come for me. Ever see a mob mad to murder, Mickey? It scares you. It's a beast. Looks like a beast, smells like a beast. I was scared. I hid out, first with my stick. Then when the mob jammed me against the table, I hopped up on it and kicked with both legs. And I floored 'em, lots of 'em. But they come up again, and the mass of 'em bent me back on the prisoner. I had to hold him, you see, and he rolled and pitched and kicked. That's what give me only one hand. And by I had only one leg. He or somebody drove an oyster knife through my ankle, in between the tendon and the bone, and nailed me to the table. I was done for, I guess. I was hit all over. Fists, knives, chairs, legs of tables. I was sore, weak. Mike, I was all in when I seen a red-headed cop dive into the hole. That's how it looked to me, like a dive head first. Maybe it was because I noticed first, and so particular, the red head on that uniform, and the red face, and the red eyes, and because they looked so good to me. 'Hold 'em, brother,' he calls to me, quiet-like and sure. 'Easy does it.' And up he turns on his feet, and begins to cut a swath up to me through that mass of men. It was beautiful. That's when I learned to use a stick right, watching him. He held it high, so as when it landed on a head, it come down level, exactly on the crown. Seems to shoot the 'lectricity down the spine, through all the nerves to all the joints, plumb to the toes. He hit no head twice. Every man he fanned closed up like a knife, and click, 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 slow, regular, nice, he laid 'em down like a corduroy road on which he walked to me. His red eyes was looking every which way, and they didn't miss a thing. I saw 'em see the knife that spiked me to the table, but they was looking at something else when his left hand pulled that knife. One jerk, and in the same stroke, drove it into a bloke that was pounding my face and left it in him. 'Baby between us,' he says, and he grabs the prisoner, yanks him to his feet, and when I, obeying him, took the other side, he says, "Forward march." And we marched. We stumbled some, and slipped off the bodies on the floor. They was coming to and moved, and some was getting up, enough to keep our sticks busy. But we marched, us three, like a battalion, to under the hole. Up we go, he says to me, and with my good foot in his two hands, he shoots me up and out like a lady mounting a horse in the park. "Now you," he says to the prisoner, and up the prisoner came to me. And then he turns, belts the two nearest heads, 2 good last belts, and he bows. "Gentlemen," he says to the mob, "good night." He hands me his hand and comes out, closes the trap-door down careful and stands on the lid. "Now then," he says to me, "you take your baby to the station and send me the off platoon with the wagon. And that little oyster knife left rust in your left ankle. Tend to it." The chief lit the cigar he had been handling as a club. When it was burning perfectly, he said, "Sweeney, I wish you wouldn't ask me nothing about Mahoney. He's a po-lice-man." End of section 79.
Section 80 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Short Stories from Life by Various. Section 80. The Quest of the VC by A. Byers Fletcher. There was tumultuous cheering in the ranks of the Irish Guards somewhere in France. Sergeant O'Reilly, V.C., had returned to the trenches. 2 months before, Private O'Reilly had, with a scorching hot machine gun, held single-handed an important trench after all his comrades had fallen. Incidentally, he had also saved the life of an officer who lay wounded and exposed on the parapet of the trench. His was but one of many such brave deeds which occurred almost daily along that terrible front, but O'Reilly's deed had the advantage of being conspicuous. Hence his 2 months' leave, his journey to London, and his reception at Buckingham Palace, where the king himself pinned the little bronze cross to his khaki jacket. Hence his public reception in his native village of Tullamelan, where they hung garlands of flowers about his neck, and his old mother wept tears of joyful pride. Hence, too, his return with the sergeant's stripes. The story of the honors heaped upon him had been duly chronicled and illustrated in the press, and had preceded his return to the trenches. Hence his joyful reception by the regiment. Private Fennessy and Private Maloney had been among the first to grasp the hero's hand, and had joined heartily in the vociferous cheering. But now that affairs had again resumed their normal round, these 2 companions sat at the bottom of the trench, smoking thoughtfully. "O'Reilly's a brave man," said Fennessy, then added, after a pause, "the lucky devil." "I believe ye," replied Maloney. "And he only 5'7", continued Fennessy. "With 1 punch," said Maloney, contemplating his hairy fist, "I could lift him into the enemy's trenches." "Do ye mind how all the girls in Tullamelan kissed him?" said Fennessy. "I know one girl there that didn't," said Maloney hotly. "And I know another," as hotly replied Fennessy. "The papers are nothing but lying rags," said Maloney. "I believe ye," said Fennessy. Viciously whistled the bullets across the top of the trench, and a shell or 2 whined overhead, unheeded by the comrades, long accustomed to the sound. "But I'm not denying," said Fennessy after a pause, "that the little brown cross is a great temptation to any girl." "It is that," agreed Maloney. At 5 o'clock the whisper ran along the trench. Since 3 o'clock the guns massed on the hills behind them had been sending a shrieking death storm into the enemy's trenches in front of the Irish Guards.
At 5, promptly, the storm of shell would cease. At a given signal, the men would clamber out over the parapet, make their way through the openings in the wire entanglements, and rush the trenches before them. There was no outward excitement. The aspect of the men remained unchanged, but one could feel the nervous tension. A young subaltern near Fennessy and Maloney glanced occasionally at his wristwatch and smoked his cigarette more rapidly than usual. "If he falls," whispered Fennessy to Maloney, "'tis meself that will bring him in." "You will not," said Maloney. "I've had me eye on him for weeks." "He can have the major," said Fennessy. "I'll not," said Maloney. "'Twould take a horse to carry him in." The batteries ceased firing. A low whistle sounded. The men grasped their rifles with bayonets fixed. Cold steel alone must do the work now. Another whistle. With a hoarse cheer, the men climbed out over the front of the trench, and the charge was on. Side by side raced Fennessy and Maloney, with eyes fixed on the young subaltern who, carrying a rifle, was sprinting on before them. For a few moments it seemed that the batteries had effectually silenced the trenches of the enemy immediately in front. 100 yards farther and they would be reached. Now, however, from that line of piled earth and barbed wire came the crackling roar of machine guns. For a moment the men wavered and many fell, but with a growl the others rushed on. 50 yards farther, and then the ground seemed to heave up and hit Fennessy and Maloney. Side by side they lay, with their faces partly rooted in the trampled ground. To their ears came dully the sound of the fierce hand-to-hand fighting beyond them. Slowly they scraped the dirt from their faces and looked at each other. "Where did they get ye, Fennessy?" asked Maloney. "In the leg," groaned Fennessy. "The same for me," moaned Maloney. The bullets of the machine guns still sang over them, and both men began to dig into the soft earth and pile it into a mound in front of their heads. Now back across the torn ground came the remnant of the charge, for the trenches had not been taken. Some ran, others walked or crawled or were carried, but always over them and among them whirled the leaden death. Soon Maloney and Fennessy were left alone in their little self-made trenches, for none of their retreating comrades had noticed them. Twilight was fading when a brilliant idea flashed across the mind of Fennessy. The intensity of the illumination almost dazed him for a moment. "Maloney," said Fennessy, "'tis not very strong ye feelin', I'm thinkin'." "Your think tank is overflowin', shut it off," growled Maloney. "Sure, Maloney, your voice is very wake. You'll be faintin' in a minute," said Fennessy soothingly. "I'll not," cried Maloney. "What's eatin' ye?" "Poor old boy," purred Fennessy. "You're in a desperate state. You must be rescued. I'm going to take ye in." "How?" asked Maloney. "I'm going to take ye on me back and crawl in with ye. It's me duty to do it, and England expects every Irishman to do his duty. Me only reward will be your gratitude," said Fennessy. Slowly the brilliant idea spread to the mind of Maloney. "Sure, Fennessy," said Maloney, "'tis brave and kind of ye, but I can't accept your sacrifice. 'Tis yourself that must be saved. I can hear the tremble in your speech. No one can say that a Maloney ever deserted a friend. I'll take ye in if I die for it." "Don't be a fool, Maloney. Ye know you're waker than I am." "I'm not," cried Maloney. "I'm as strong as a horse, and I'm going to save ye or perish in the attempt." "Ye selfish baste," howled Fennessy. "You'd spoil me chance for the V.C., would ye?" "Selfish baste yourself," roared Maloney. "'Tis me own chance, and in you'll go on me back, dead or alive." Maloney and Fennessy reached for each other. Back in the trenches of the Irish Guards, the young subaltern, peering through a loophole, saw dimly through the growing dusk the struggles of Maloney and Fennessy. "Poor devils," he muttered, "must be in agony. Didn't know any were left alive out there." Even as he spoke, a wiry figure beside him sprang to the top of the parapet and started toward the struggling men. Now the enemy's trench awoke again, but presently, through the zone of death, The subaltern and all who could secure loopholes saw that wiry figure slowly crawling back toward their trench, dragging behind him two reluctant but exhausted men. As the limp bodies of Fennessy and Maloney slid down into the trench, a cheer broke forth from the men, which drowned the noise of the firing. Slowly, Fennessy and Maloney opened their eyes. The subaltern was speaking. "Sergeant O'Reilly," he said, "if such a thing were possible, you deserve and should have another Victoria Cross." Again the cheers broke forth. Fennessy looked at Maloney. "For the love of Mike," said Fennessy. "I believe ye," said Maloney. End of section 80.
Section 81 of Short Stories from Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Short Stories from Life by Various. Somewhere in Belgium by Percy Godfrey Savage. The crude little cottage had been surrounded and two stalwart peasant boys routed out, but only one gun had been found. Each lad stoutly swore that he was responsible for the sniping. The old mother stood near them. "Choose one, or we will shoot both," the German officer again ordered the old woman. Her shrunken, toil-worn frame seemed to suffer pain of death. She wound her rough hands in her apron. Terror, hatred, love, devotion, helplessness filled her eyes. Alphonse, the tall, light-haired boy, was urging the smaller and more delicate Petro by gestures and eager, low words to yield the punishment to him. With equal intensity, the little fellow pleaded to take the blame because Alphonse would be better able to care for their mother. The imperturbable German, not asking for more than one life, set the decision before the mother herself. Apparently it would be necessary to shoot both of them. Soldiers stood waiting for their part in the procedure. The old woman turned aside. "Take Alphonse," she groaned. Surprised but satisfied, they took the boy to the side of the house and fired upon him. Perhaps a thought of another youth, perhaps the wonder of why the old woman had chosen, perhaps a burden of conscience delayed the officer as he followed his men from the yard. "Quick, Petro," whispered the mother, and the boy, who had been standing rigid, with the horror of his brother's death gripping his heart, came to life. Like a shadow he disappeared. The next instant there was a shot, and the German officer fell in the road. A pack of wild beasts rushed towards the house. Two of them fell. Somewhere inside the dwelling Petro was killed, but there was neither shot nor cry. They found the old peasant kneeling beside the doorway. "I said, take Alphonse, O God," she moaned. "But," she shrieked with fierce satisfaction as her enemies appeared, "because Petro could aim better with his gun." 3 graves on the right of the cottage held the peasants, but 3 graves on the left held their toll. End of section 81. Read by Alan Mapstone. End of Short Stories from Life by Various.